To begin with, you want to start off with a outline that maps out all the shapes, including the shadow shapes. That's the cast shadow and the form shadow on your objects and maybe on the table top as well. So it should look like this. And then you're going to need to go in and start to paint it. So I did want to show you how to color match using a scrap of paper. Some of you are already familiar with this technique and others need to learn. So here's what you're going to do. Paint, I like to go right to my subject. So the subject is the red apple. That's the main focal. There's other areas that are important, but this is the focal point. And remember, focal point is the thing that catches your eye first. The first step is to make up a pile of the main color of that object. So I'm trying to match the shadow side first, and I'm painting on a scrap of paper and holding it up to that apple and seeing how closely I have a true match, because it may not be pure cad red, for example. It might have a little bit of the crimson color or a tiny bit of blue added to it. Now, once I'm satisfied with the color that I've matched, again, it does not have to be 100% accuracy in terms of color matching. It's actually way more important that the value is correct. Then I can go in and start to paint. When you are painting, the direction of your stroke is so important when you're painting a form. So a form is an object that is 3D. It's no longer flat. It has an area that bulges out and turns away from the viewer. And I paint dark to light. I'd like you to do that as well. So you're painting the shadow areas first, and you can twist your brush. It's kind of an extension of tick marks, and curve your brush around that form. Kind of picture it as a miniature globe, and you're wrapping the strokes like a string of yarn around a ball. Technically, what we're painting is a red colored sphere. It's a ball, but there are areas where it kind of indents, like where the stem is. So you're going to have to pay attention to any shift in terms of the form, if it sinks in or bulges out, and you want to try and describe that with value and with your brush stroke direction. There is a little bit of reflected light where the cloth is actually bouncing. The color of the cloth is bouncing onto the apple's surface. That's because the apple is very shiny. So it's bouncing into the apple and creating some reflected light, which is fun stuff. For the lighter side of the form, I like to go intense. So I'm going very vibrant with my colors. So this is pretty much cad red, a little bit of crimson, and some yellow. Now each picture is slightly different, but they are the same apples. You may just have one apple, or you have two apples, or you may have the two apples plus the leaf. I wanted to make them intentionally different so that you're not all doing the same exact thing, and also so that you have some choice over which one you're going to do. This practice will help you with every other painting you create in my class, and it could help you beyond, because it's so important that you're able to make something appear round. And if you look, I'm kind of spiraling around the apple, curving that stroke, still thinking about short marks. So just like with the tick mark exercise, I'm doing short strokes, really no more than an inch, maybe an inch and a quarter at most. And I am trying to gradiate it. So it's more like a radial gradient. Remember, a gradient is when one color starts to shift into another. It can be value-wise, but it can also be temperature-wise too. The thing about a sphere is you need to have a form shadow, you need to have midtones or halftones, and you need to have reflected light and a highlight. So the highlight is kind of like a little pat of butter. It's that sparkle. You see it so often in like a human eye, for example, there's a highlight. That highlight needs to be a slow progression. It can't be all of a sudden white. And by the way, you never want to use pure white on its own. You always flavor it with another color. So mine has a little bit of a red-orange cast right now. I'm going to put a dot of yellow into the brightest point. So it's almost like it's melting into the skin of that apple. And you don't want it to be separate from the apple. It should be kind of embedded. My composition, I have a half of an apple and it's a green apple, so it's going to be skewed a little bit more yellow-green in terms of what's called local value. That means the actual direct color of the object is yellow-green, but then there's shadows falling on it, right? So I have to look again for the form shadows. I have to look for the midtones, the halftones, the highlight. I'll have to check if there's any reflected light. And then I'm going to have to adapt for the inside of the apple because it's going to be a different value. Same deal though, you're curving your stroke and kind of twisting your brush to fit in there. You don't want to do super long strokes, you're doing short strokes, especially if you're transitioning from one color to another, which is called a gradient. Your goal is to make these forms turn. That means making it look like it's three-dimensional, so you're trying to go for something somewhat realistic. We talk about realism all the time when we talk about art. It doesn't have to be 100% realistic, it can be stylized, but I want the idea of mass and curves. I did do the leaves off camera, or I started them at least, and right now I'm switching over to the cast shadows. So cast shadows are a darker version of whatever the ground plane is. So if the ground plane were green, my cast shadow would be a darker version of that green. And I'm looking any place where there's a cast shadow. Rules about cast shadows is cast shadows tend to be sharper compared to like a form shadow, and they do blur the farther away from the form that they get. And the shape of the shadow is important because it's a direct correlation between the object, like the shape of the leaf should be the shape of the cast shadow. The cast shadow should mimic that. Putting cast shadows in is one of my favorite parts of the painting process because that's when I feel like objects become grounded. They're no longer these weird floating objects. They're actually sitting on top of an actual ground plane. In this case, they're sitting on top of this kind of wrinkly cloth. So you want to look at how the shadows change as they move away from the form. Like this one is, there's like a wrinkle on the cast shadow, so I'm trying to portray that wrinkle too, and the cast shadow does get a little bit lighter as it moves away from the apple itself. So pay attention to those kinds of nuances. Again, short strokes when you're doing this. Think about tick marks. You're painting it like an impressionist would paint this. And then you're going to any shadow area and painting that. Remember, we really like to work from dark to light in this class. It's good practice, especially if you decide to move on to oil painting, but for both acrylic and oil painters, it's smart to work from dark to light. For the turquoise areas where your cloth is moving more into midtones and lights, you want to treat that exactly like the tick mark exercise. I know I keep saying that, but that is how you paint it. You want to paint in different directions, not all predictable. So if you were to try and paint it all vertical strokes, it would look kind of uninteresting and boring. You want to kind of move with the direction of the cloth. I often was painting in like X's, so making like diagonal marks. You can see like kind of little freckles of paint all over the surface kind of at random, and then I layer it on top. So the thing about acrylic painting is you're not done after one layer. You have to hit it up with a second, even a third layer. So my finished paintings oftentimes have 4 layers of paint, and that's the same for acrylic versus oil. So here is layer 1. By layer 2, I will get this stronger. I'm going to show you at some point the layer 2 on this painting, but that is your task. Now, I do think it's really good practice to photograph your work, so I would photograph it after layer 1, and then when you get layer 2 on there, photograph it again. And you may find that layer 1 you like better, but that's okay. It's part of the process of learning to be a better artist, being able to paint something more than one time, and working on layers. And the reason we layer is so that the paint becomes more opaque and less transparent.